Dragon Quest works on multiple layers. There's the childlike and simple understanding, a different outlook on a few jokes once you're mature enough to understand paths, and finally a layer for the literature savvy folk. Now, a way to tell apart good and great literature is that you can devour good books in one night, but great books force you to constantly put them down and think about the text. Nowadays I treat the Dragon Quest series at large as a great book, on the third layer I described, so over the years I've spent a disgusting amount of time scribbling down countless notes on different nuances. These extend past specific plot details and observations about the gameplay mechanics all the way to statements about the series at large. And I'd love to turn every single one of them into their own 10-minute video, but I can't. I don't have infinite time, but what I can do is turn them into disgustingly concise shorts, which I've compiled here. They turned out pretty hard to digest, incomplete, and each of those shorts has 2 or 3 ideas shoved in, but I decided to not worry about people commenting that they can understand what I'm saying. Before the first idea, I do want to go back on one thing I said earlier though. The difference between good and great books I made up was incorrect, I just couldn't come up with a more concise phrasing. It's untrue that more demanding literature is inherently better. A comparison would be read versus math. Some junkies need more to get their fix, and the latter is more potent, but one doesn't make the other obsolete. They're fundamentally different experiences. Similarly, I don't think that different layers of Dragon Quest games are worth more than others, especially since, for example, Rocket Slime has only one layer and it's a question of taste whether you can enjoy that sort of campiness. A childlike experience with Dragon Quest VII is no less valuable than some addict that's incoherently yapping about the parallels between its literal and meta narrative. The Dragon Quest Your Story ending wasn't well received. The plot twist that the entire story took place inside a video game was meant to convey the idea of a video game becoming real through our subjective experience with it. One of the many reasons this felt so empty though was that there are 2 layers of fiction. The world the protagonist wakes up in is just as non-existent to us as the video game world, and the same goes for our subjective reality and perception of Dragon Quest V. Now Builders 2 has a very similar plot twist. The whole game takes place within an illusion spell that you encounter in Dragon Quest 2, and the ending is about how the protagonist will build it into a real world. From there on you're left with post-game, and the only things to do here are to make original creations, to share them online, and to see what other people made. Ultimately, you're left to give meaning to the world or to sneak glimpses of someone else's expression of self, all while fully aware that the medium is just an illusion. The human aspect that the player base injects into this fictional world is tangible in every creation, far more so than in some fictional character's monologue. And while Dragon Quest has given you countless other fake worlds before, I only compare these 2 because they're the only ones to try to comment on the role of the audience within art. Linear as well as non-linear Dragon Quest games have their merits. 11, however, is a linear game that likes to give you the illusion of choice, and it does so on multiple levels. It hands you a boat, but only one dog besides immediate dead ends. The library might look like a mind-bending puzzle, but if you break it down, there's only ever one button you can press at any given point, and that is the right one. There's never a different option to consider, no corridors to get lost in. But this isn't exclusive to 11. 99% of your choices don't affect the stories, yet Dragon Quest titles keep asking you for your input. The question Dragon Quest has always struggled with is what exactly the player's role within each part of the game is. Is it on the players to immerse themselves in an adventure that's set in stone, or should a game allow the players to mold it into something individual? It's a hard question, the answer to which fluctuates even within a single game. But regardless, the great moments are always the authentic ones, not weighed down by sleight of hand. Silent protagonists aren't self-inserts. Sure, you name the character, you tend to see from their perspective, and they don't express themselves directly, but for example with Psarro in The Dark Prince, it becomes apparent that they can be so much more. At many points the game asks you to make a choice that would prevent so much harm from being done, but whatever you try to choose, Psarro ignores it and won't be made to change his mind. If you're inserting yourself and making choices from his perspective, then you'll never find out that those decisions don't matter. If you're trying to stop him, however, then you're made to understand how it must feel for the people around him to be ignored when they try to reason with Psarro. Suddenly the point of identification shifts onto the surrounding cast. If you go through the game with a narrow view that the protagonist must be someone you insert yourself into, then the game would seem horrible, since players that can't identify with him can't mold him into someone else. You'd miss all the nuance and out on an otherwise fun experience. Dragon Quest X is a mainline game in the sense that it's a number title, but some people don't see it that way since it's an MMO which is far from what they expect from the series. But one look at the indisputable mainline's lack of consistency in terms of gameplay and story should suffice to dispute any of that idea's claims to objectivity. What connects all the games is a player experience, an ethereal vibe. 8 and 9 have very little in common. You can't really customize your party in 8 and you don't really have an overworld to explore in 9, but both give you a sense of individualizing your adventure. And not only do 8 and 9 have less in common with each other than 9 and 10, the series' traditions are rarely valued as much as the feelings they invoke, and regardless of how it gets there, 10 feels like a Dragon Quest game. It also feels like an MMO, which is why I don't like it, but an association between quality and the also coveted mainline status has nothing to do with it. And remember this for whenever we get more info on 12. Changes to elements that we loosely associate as being part of the Dragon Quest identity don't mean anything because the Dragon Quest identity runs deeper than that, and you can never tell whether a game is true to the series without playing it for yourself. Dragon Quest doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the Demon Kings. They might be extremely relevant in universe, but they aren't important to the players. They represent an obstacle to overcome, maybe the demiurge from Gnostic tradition, but the games don't humanize these forces of evil because that's what's expedient for the story. So if a Dragon Quest game wants to put a focus on a villain, it's their servants or puppets. These range from Larger to Dulmagus and Jasper to Corvus and Psauro. These last two are quite interesting because given how they're the final bosses of their respective games, they're often part of the discussion surrounding Demon Kings. But that's not their role, they've just been corrupted by the greater evils their worlds had to offer. It is however why those games are often falsely cited as having the only good antagonists out of all Dragon Quest games. Dragon Quest 4 and 9 see you fighting Rapthorn around the halfway point and Dulmagus at the very end. Dragon Quest games use similar events to play with your expectations. How often have you visited a town where all NPCs are visible but you can't yet interact with any of them? This might mean that everyone is under a spell, frozen or petrified. For simplicity, I'll call all of these events where people are frozen in time Petrification. They play out similarly. You immediately see what's wrong, i.e. people are frozen, but then you have to figure out the underlying causes, which allows for plot twists as you learn more and more about what happened. In that sense, they might seem formulaic and hard to distinguish, but what's interesting is how exactly they break out of that mold. In Regenstein, the people used to pray for rain during times of drought, but the rain they got turned into stone. Afterwards, the rain they had hoped for went on to erode the statues so that you can't restore them anymore. Everyone is dead from the moment you get there, but due to the past entries, Petrification implies a hope for escape that you are then robbed of. And thematically, this extends past NPCs all the way to the great evils that are sealed away. You intuitively know that there's no happy ending until they're gone for good, which can then again be subverted. Whenever a game gets remade, people count monsters being visible on the overworld as a plus, but that's forgetting about the actual execution. There's a night and day difference between a boss troll strolling around the Black Citadel and a stationary dumbass. It's about careful consideration that if the enemy pool wasn't made with placements in mind, a few monsters will look awkward or out of place. I don't think the overworld encounters in any mainline game have reached their full potential yet, even if 11 is kinda close. There's still an inherent level of enjoyment to visible monsters since you can actively avoid or seek them out, but random encounters have less clutter, they're possibly more relaxing, and they can help highlight other mechanics, i.e. notorious monsters in 8 feel less special on 3DS. What it doesn't inherently result in is less encounters as we see with Dragon Quest 7 where the overworld is cluttered with hard or impossible to avoid monsters. I hope Dragon Quest 12 has overworld encounters, but they don't need to be shoehorned into every upcoming remake. Dragon Quest 7 has the highest browse storytelling in the series. I don't mean that it has an interesting plot, good pacing or eloquently written text, not even the undeniable thematic depth. The sole trait that led me to this conclusion is the lack of a perceived intentionality behind the emotions it invokes. When Kiefer leaves you, the game doesn't blast this sad song to make you realize that you just witnessed something sad. It leaves you with a situation and alone with your thoughts and relatively neutral music. Was bringing Ellie back into the world without her master, back into an endless cycle of disappointment, really the moral thing to do? The style doesn't necessarily make Dragon Quest VII's the more catching story. It will never elicit emotional high moments like Dragon Quest V or be as easy to digest for that exact reason, but it allows the story to be discussed and thought about in more depth. So that was that. Going forward, I won't be making as many of these 10-minute rants about the haiku in Japan or anything anymore. I'll instead try and integrate those ideas into videos that, just like Dragon Quest, work on different layers. You'll see exactly what I mean in my next one. That one has at least 2 sections that I could have made into a short, but that's for another day. The ideas you saw right now are just ones that don't fit into any of the many video ideas I have lined up, and that aren't so important to me that I'd make a video because of them. But I still like them too much to not release in any form. This video won't get many views, so there's a chance I might retrain some of these ideas for future videos. There's also a chance for me to make more shorts like this, only time will tell. Within a system regulated by supply and demand, you shouldn't try to supply what people don't yet know they demand, at least not without layers.